Ladies and gentlemen, it really is indeed an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm going to start by giving a few anecdotal stories around Nelson. Lord Rennick, who was the former ambassador to South Africa, tells one in particular, which I think to some degree symbolizes the meaning and essence of who Mandela is, what he represents, and what he epitomizes for not only, I think, South Africans, but the world in general. He said he gets a call from Nelson and he says, Ambassador, please will you come to Shell House? So he willingly obeys and arrives at Shell House. He walks into a very big boardroom and sits opposite Mandela, and Mandela says, no, please come and sit next to me. And Lord Rennick says, this is highly unusual. I mean, I'm the British ambassador, and this is the future president of the Republic of South Africa, and he's asked me to sit next to him. And then he says, lo and behold, the doors open, and in walk 70 Labour MPs. And now he thinks he's in a very awkward situation, because here he is sitting next to the future president, and walking into the room now are 70 Labour MPs. They sit around the table, and Mandela turns to the Labour MPs and says, I'd like you to meet my political advisor, Lord Rennick. At which point Lord Rennick says he almost chokes on the water he's drinking. Now, why am I telling you this story? Lord Rennick went on to say it was the political shrewdness of Mandela, because he did not want these Labour MPs to attack Margaret Thatcher. He was not interested in engaging in a political discussion around the merits or demerits of her policy towards South Africa. He wasn't interested. And I think that goes to the heart and soul. Here was a leader who branded the ANC, its military wing, Nelson Mandela and all the others as terrorists. We jump forward to the 1990s. He is now a revered leader. Benji discussed it, the ambassadors discussed it. But I think it highlights who he was to a large degree and what his objectives were. I'm just going to... We saw in the film him being interviewed in 1961. That most probably is the most seminal interview he has ever given. Why? Because it gives the first indications that the ANC are moving away from passive resistance to armed struggle. Now, before I go on, I'd like to tell a wonderful anecdotal story regarding that with Ahmed Kathadra. He was the gentleman who was instructed to bring Brian Woodlake to that meeting. The night before, he does a dry run. And he drives around, he goes to the house, and the next day he picks up Brian Woodlake. And during the course of taking Brian Woodlake to meet Mandela at this house, Brian Woodlake says to him, I'd like to congratulate you on the most wonderful, brilliant countermeasure maneuvers I have ever seen to ensure that you're not being followed. And Ahmed Kathadra says, thank you very much. When we were interviewing Ahmed Kathadra, he recounts the story. He says, the one thing I did not tell Brian Woodlake is the reality was I got lost and I couldn't remember how to enter. And I was driving around and around and around. And I said, that's going to dispel and really upset Brian Woodlake, because he even mentioned to me, he told me how wonderful you were in your countermeasure maneuvers to ensure that you weren't being followed. We told Brian Woodlake, and he was incredibly disappointed and said, that shattered my image of what happened. But the point is, Nelson gives this indication. And again, we must understand it, because again, as we move into this, the 70s and 80s, they're branded as a terrorist organization. And as Benji has highlighted, they had a policy of Secretariat, which was the notion of passive resistance, influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. And Nelson, leaving a party with my mother one night, turned to her and said, it is with a heavy heart and a heavy hand that we turn to armed struggle. That again highlights the character of the individual as well as the character of the collective organization. Because I think in talking about Nelson and his legacy, and again, what it means to the current situation here in Israel with the Palestinians, we mustn't lose sight of a very fundamental aspect. He was part of a unique collective. The ambassador made a quote regarding Walter Sisulu. We stand in admiration of a leader who came out of prison after 27 years, who showed no bitterness, who showed no anger, who recognized that in order to take the society that had been torn apart, and again we can draw parallels to where we are today in Israel, based upon a racial hatred, a white supremacy, not a hatred for whites, I think we must understand that, but white supremacy. And in the analysis, we always lose that interpretation. It was about white supremacy. He came out of prison, and he realized that in order for the interest of the country, bitterness, hatred, and anger would not take the country forward. But we must acknowledge, underpinning that, are people like O.R. Tambo, Walter Sisulu, Governor Becky, Duma Nokwe, Wilton McQuire, J.B. Marks, Moses Katana, because they were all had the same attitude and outlook. In fact, when Nelson came to Johannesburg, he was actually a radical. Mandela, the world had got to know, the Mandela of compromise, the Mandela of understanding, the Mandela who did not seek retribution, but wanted to lay a path of conciliation, because the needs of the country outweighed the needs of the individual. And that was a strong tradition within the ANC. So while we talk about the importance and the legacy of Mandela and what in the current crisis that is confronting Israel and Palestine, we mustn't lose sight of that he was a representative of an organization that at the heart of its ideals were these principles that he espoused. That these were principles that all these other leaders believed in. There is a wonderful, it's not a wonderful, an incident, I should say, that happened to O.R. Tambo. And again, this epitomizes the notion of tolerance, understanding of what Mandela represented. But not just Mandela, what the ANC as a political organization represented. So again, as Israelis, as citizens of Israel and of Palestine, one also needs to look at the collective leadership. Because there was an incident where O.R. was walking down the street and a white spat in his face. And he said he remembered it. It was something that he remembered very clearly. He spat in his face because he was a black. But in the articulation of that incident, you get no sense of anger, bitterness, resentment, hatred, or hostility. So while we're here this evening to pay homage to a very unique man, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that he was the embodiment of an organization and an embodiment of a collective, a very unique group of collective leaders of selfless sacrifice. When Nelson said from the dock, and before I go on to talk about his I am prepared to die statement, it was written up by Joel Joffrey. And everyone knows that famous last element of that statement. If needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Now, Joel Joffe removed that last statement from what he had written, because he was asked to write it up. So when it came back to Nelson to check, Nelson said to Joel Joffe, "Where is it? We don't believe you should say it." Nelson turned to him and said, "You know what, if I don't say it, then everything I stood for has been meaningless, without substance, and without merit, because everywhere I went, I have stated to the people that I am prepared to die." Now here I am, about to deliver a statement of why we as the ANC moved away from passive resistance to armed struggle, and you have removed this element from my speech. It will mean that I was a fraud. Everything I said to the people, it would be meaningless. And it was put back in, and then of course there's debate around whether they should use should, you know, again semantics, but anyway the discussion took place. But why do I say it? Again, it goes to the heart of conviction. We talk about the man, but we mustn't also lose sight of the fact that these were individuals who had deep-seated commitment. Because when he said, "I am prepared to die," he was not just speaking for himself. He spoke for the other trialists, that they were prepared to pay the ultimate sacrifice of death for a cause and a belief and a commitment. Now, when we look at the South African situation, in terms of going back, I remember around 85, Joe Slover and my father said, they will never see South Africa again. They are going to die in exile. 5 years later, or I should say from 85, the process of the releasing of the Rivonia trialists began, with first with Dennis Goldberg, with the assistance of the Israelis, and then gradually leading through to the end with Big Nelson. Now, why do I raise that? Because it highlights that regardless of how bad things were during the 80s, there was still optimism. There was still a belief. Whether they thought they would achieve it in their lifetime, that was debatable. But there was a firm belief that one day change will come. Now, Benji also made reference to de Klerk, and I think, again, we must show our respect to F.W. de Klerk. Why? Because while we pay homage to Nelson, saying, look what he did, cometh the hour, cometh the man, he took us down a path whereby we could have fallen into violent civil war. Again, he mentioned Constant Duluth. I mean, within that context, the assassination of Chris Hani was the most defining moment in our country. It showed the statesman-like ability of Nelson. A lot of people in the country say that was the time that he became President of the Republic of South Africa, when he went on national TV and said, yes, Chris Hani has been killed, and we know amongst our people there is anger, there is a sense of revenge, that they want the blood, they want to take revenge. And we can go back, because in the early 60s, when they moved to armed struggle, they read the situation perfectly, because they recognized, he and the others recognized also, that moving to armed struggle in the early 60s, they were harnessing the anger of their members. President Zuma last year, at the 50th anniversary of the raid on Ladysmith, at the dinner, said, we at that point in 1961 wants to run through the streets of Durban with machetes, killing every single white person that we could find. But because of the foresight, the understanding of the feeling of the people, MK became the avenue to harness and to channel the anger and the resentment that was building up. It would contain them. We jump forward to 1993, and the same foresight that was displayed by Mandela and the other great leaders reappeared, where he went on national TV and said to the people, violence will not achieve what we have struggled for. We have spent 27 years in prison, and we are not going to waste that 27 years by allowing the country to disintegrate into anarchy and war. Because at the end of the day, it is not going to solve the problem that we have had in South Africa, not just since 1948, but we can go back to 300 years. That has a very strong historical root. And why do I raise that? Because when the 3 Israelis were kidnapped, I wondered at that time, and it crossed my mind, why did not the Prime Minister go on national TV and speak to the people of Israel, recognizing that the anger was going to boil up and that there would be a sense of retribution. And that highlights again the understanding of leaders like Nelson Mandela, that they understood the feelings of the people and they needed to ensure that they harnessed the feelings of the people and controlled the feelings of the people to ensure that it doesn't get out of control. And I think that is fundamental to understanding not only Nelson Mandela, who was the symbol and became the symbol of our liberation struggle and became the voice of the liberation struggle, but also the voice of reason. A voice of reason which was also helped by people like de Klerk, because you also need on the other side of the fence your political adversaries to also be brought along. And he had the ability to bring them along. He had the political astuteness, the common touch, the ability to bring humour in. Again, let me just give you an example. The last time he was at Lilies Leaf was in 2005, and Arthur Goldwhite is there to greet him. The car pulls up. Arthur now is beaming because he's now going to be seeing Nelson. Nelson gets out of the car and says, "Oh, Arthur, lovely to see you, and thanks to you I spent 27 years in prison." At which point, Arthur's face went ash white. Nelson was beaming and said, "Oh, let's go and sit." But the point being is that he was able to see the humorous side of things. I mean, that is a thing. Again, people will say, well, what is the relevance of it? The fact of the matter is that he did have an idea, because the fact of the matter is that the papers that were found at Lilies Leaf were supposed to have been destroyed, and Arthur hid the papers in the coal shed at Lilies Leaf, which enabled the authorities to bring Nelson as accused number 1 to the Rivonia trial. But it highlights the individual, that he was a man of the moment who could also show humour, humility, and a political astuteness and political awareness of how to deal with intractable problems and how to ensure that they did not become stumbling blocks through the process of negotiation, which I believe we can all learn from the lessons of South Africa. Because we were on the verge of civil war after the assassination of Chris Hani. And those words that Nelson Mandela spoke, that you heard briefly, calmed the country down, both black and white. Because as Benji said, there was also fear amongst the whites. Anxiety that we are going to be killed. We are the minority, and there is a huge amount of resentment out there. But as, again, in concluding, Nelson said that freedom, walking out of prison, was only the start of the journey. It was not the end of the journey. And again, I think that's an important lesson, because I think sometimes people think once you start to negotiate, that is the end of the journey, but it's not. It's actually the beginning. The hard part began post-1994, because that was when things could have fallen apart. And that is when leaders like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Governor Mbeki, and the others provided the moral turpitude and guidance to ensure that we traveled the path of peace, reconciliation, and understanding. Thank you very much.